Welcome back to the Convo Couch, my humans. I am Pasta Jardula.
And I'm Fiorella.
And Jonny Sue is still spinning on those ones and twos. And today on the couch, we have a great guest. He is a college professor with a PhD in history. He's also a historian of the Middle East and Europe. Some people call him William, but we call him Dr. Liam O'Mara. And he's running for Congress in California's District 42. How you doing today, Liam?
Hey, good. Glad to be here.
We're glad you're here with us.
Yeah, welcome.
All right, so let's just jump right into it because a lot of people don't know, with the COVID going on, electoral politics has seemed to have gone a little bit of a sleep. But we do have a race right here in CA-42, and you're involved. You actually won the jungle primary, I believe. You finished second place. That means there's only going to be two choices. Before you tell us about you, tell us about your opponent and why you're running against him.
Well, let's see. Start with the fact that this is his 28th year in office.
Ooh.
I just turned 46, and he was elected the year I turned 18, the first election I was, which just seems a little wrong to me. In that time, he has almost never done town halls. He's been about 10 years since he's done a town hall. And when he did, they were tightly scripted. He doesn't answer constituent questions, whether by telephone, social media, anything else. He has an extremely authoritarian record with a 0% from ACLU, which tends to infuriate me, and has a long history of race baiting and anti-immigrant stuff here, which also very problematic in California and just as a human being to me.
Yep.
And 98% of his contributions come from corporations.
What's his name, and is he a Republican or Democrat?
He's a Republican, Ken Calvert. He's one of the last three Republicans in Southern California. The 8th, the 42nd, and the 50th are the only ones where they're left. And demographically, the 8th and the 42nd are getting pretty purple. And I think it's about time for change.
Yeah. How did he vote on the Patriot Act?
Oh, he's wildly in favor of any kind of surveillance and increasing the power of the state, voted for every war. I mean,
I don't like this guy. Go ahead,
He's
fam.
pretty bad.
I don't like this guy, fam. Cam Calvert.
Your civil liberties. Yeah. So we'll talk about that later. But what is the most pressing issue you would say right now in your district that you would address first and foremost?
In my district, I guess it's the overall state of economic development. I mean, across the Inland Empire as a whole, less than half the population make a living wage. Portions of my district are a little bit better off because a lot of people have moved out to it from LA and Orange County and settled into the bedroom communities there. But more than 30% of the population have to commute out for work. And that's just unsustainable. The traffic is already obscene. And we're not really developing anything in the area. We have mostly just logistics and warehouse work. All that's going to disappear to robots very soon. And all the driving and everything else. We still do not have a single university in the 42nd. So unfortunately, I'm one of those commuters. Yeah. I mean, it's not preparing for the future at all.
Yeah. Right now, we're seeing a lot of results of decades of racial injustice and police brutality, especially with the death of George Floyd. And some might argue that it is an economic problem. Some people argue that it's a race problem. What's more important to you, racial justice or economic justice, or maybe a little bit of both?
Yeah, I don't really see any distinction between the two of them at the end of the day because they've always been inextricably linked. I mean, this country was built on the backs of the extermination of indigenous peoples and on slavery. So there's an economic rationale to all of that. You people are not using your land correctly. We'll just take it and kill you, or obviously replace you then with slaves that we can bring over. And then obviously the country has benefited from that tremendously. And as we moved away from some of the more overt racism, like say slavery, we replaced it with tons of other more subtle forms of discrimination, initially with obviously segregation, as that began to wind down with tons of de facto segregation, everything from the redlining in the Depression era all the way through to the present. You see, there's a vast wealth disparity. I mean, the difference between the average Black American and the average white American is about 10 to 1. In terms of wealth. And that reflects the long-term history here. And it's, to me, when people talk about reparations for racial injustice, I don't like the focus on the much older stuff because I think that's a handout to the Republicans. When we talk about slavery, no one's alive that was a slave. Okay, yeah, get it. How about the injustices from this year? and last year and the year before that and the year before that never actually went away, that continue to keep large chunks of the American population economically subordinate. And if you can, I mean, improving the economic situation is not going to eliminate the racism, but it takes away some of the arguments the right can make, at least, because they can point to a lot of the effects of poverty. I mean, poverty does lead to higher crime rates. So we see higher crime rates in a lot of minority communities. And the racists like to say, oh, it's their culture or something, which is complete nonsense. It's a reflection of the basic conditions of life. So if we can address those, it makes it easier to, over a long period of time, unpack some of that cultural racism.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Yeah,
Great
absolutely. It's definitely, they're all definitely threaded together, and they are both arms of the establishment, of what these people use to separate us. So we're also seeing that you really like a Green New Deal. I saw on your website that you're supportive of something like a Green New Deal, but then you also like UBI. How does a Green New Deal work with a UBI? Because sometimes people are on opposing ends of those two issues. And can we even have that in the current capitalist system we have, where corporations are in charge and Wall Street is in charge?
Well, that's a big question right there. Let's start with the latter part about the basic structures, because at the end of the day, we live in an oligarchy. We have essentially recreated the old aristocratic systems of Europe, but without titles and instead with billions.
Right.
And we give tremendous power to the wealthy in this country, and that does limit the scope for change. It's been a big problem. The more we have backed away from attacking the core bribery and allowing that corruption to build up, the harder and harder it has gotten to get anything done. I honestly think that Congress deserves its 7% approval rating, because it does not do much with the American people. It's like, hey, let's rename a post office this year. Let's not do anything actually of substance. And we start talking about things like Green New Deal, Medicare for all, basic income. These are all big projects. And a lot of them do involve rethinking some parts of the way our economy work. And we have to win those arguments too. I mean, as long as people continue, and this is true of not only of Republicans, but a lot of Democrats, as long as we continue to think of the federal budget like a household budget and misunderstand completely how state economies work, it's difficult to actually win the argument for significant investment. And yet we have done our best in this country when we have invested, when we have dumped that cash into the economy, because when the state dumps a bunch of cash into things and starts moving forward in things, it helps the entire economy, which also helps the tax revenue and everything else. I don't see an easy way to distinguish a lot of these. For me, basic income is about abolishing poverty. I mean, at the end of the day, that's really it. For me, it would eliminate poverty as long as we're not immediately collapsing the entire existing welfare state. It would give a leg up to tons of people, allow them to contribute more. And but there's a ton of areas in which green investment also helps. I mean, because we've always, dumped a lot of the most polluting areas in minority parts of the country. I mean, there's a lot of like racial injustice issues tied into what we want to do with the Green New Deal as well, which also Green New Deal includes jobs guarantee, it includes housing, tons of other things that also directly affect poverty rates. So to me, they're parts of the same thing, as is the Medicare issue. And I honestly don't get the argument a lot of people make for, let's pick one or the other and all agree going in, let's only talk about this one thing. Like, no, to me, this is like all parts of a single larger problem. And we need to proceed on all tracks at once, because every one of these is going to take a lot of negotiation, a lot of effort, a lot of winning arguments in the public sphere. So proceed on every single track at once and see what we can get done first.
Yeah, I like your whole mentality. Let's get it all on the table. I think that's a good rallying cry, because a lot of people don't understand the nuances of what you just talked about when it comes to a Green New Deal and what's tied to it. And same with Medicare for all. We're foreign policy junkies on this show, and you say foreign policy is a personal issue to you, that ending these interventionist wars is pivotal. What's your opinion on the following situations when it comes to foreign policy with the United States, macro sense, between us and Russia, us and China, and us and how we handle the Israeli-Palestine situation? I know that's a lot, but if you can unpack that.
Okay, so Russia, China, and Israel, Palestine?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we really think that those are like, well, on a worldwide scale, you know, Russia and China, where we are with them. And I think a lot of people demonize both Russia and China when they need to be our frenemy. We need to be talking to them. And the Israeli-Palestine situation, which really fuels a lot
difficult.
of it fuels all the hate in that region. And our part to play in this really could be pivotal. We can really change the whole region by not only our actions, but helping out with this situation. So.
Oh, sure. They all have a lot of nuances to them. The latter one, I think, in particular, is difficult to unpack in just a couple of minutes there. And I wouldn't say it's all of the hate or conflict, but it does play a significant part in driving a lot of that. It's a big chunk of the problem. All right, so yeah, foreign policy, big issue for me personally. It's always been a shame that it's difficult to run on in politics because most Americans just aren't interested, although I find a lot of younger voters really are. That's good. Out on the campaign trail, the only time I ever get questions on foreign policy, it's from high school and college kids. They care a lot more, which I think is fabulous. But yeah, I'm gunning for the Foreign Affairs Committee personally. On the Russia issue, as with so many of the problems we have in the world, our basic posture helps to further those divides and create enemies. Our problems with Russia go back more than a century, and there's a lot of acrimony and a lot of bad blood, and it's not going to be solved very quickly. And there's also a ton of corruption and misinformation within that country. It is hardly a bastion of freedom. So regardless of what the U.S. does, they are going to continue to exploit the history to propagandize in their own population. So it's going to be very difficult to get to a place where we're better off. The best way to do that is to back the hell off a little bit and to stop pushing people as much. But at the same time, you can't ignore a lot of the other problems that are being caused, like the whole issue that just came up here with the bounties in Afghanistan that's in the news right now. That's hard to ignore. I mean, we're not at war with Russia, and here's Russia saying, hey, can you kill some Americans? That'd be kind of
then here is the Democrats talking about sanctioning, and now sanctions are an act of war, and sanctions have primarily led to a lot of the countries that are suffering now to really, really be economically impoverished and be unable to come out of that. Is it really necessary to go and dictate what's going on in Russia? And what about the years that we have occupied Afghanistan? Wouldn't that be more influential than, say, all of a sudden Russia coming in? It just seems a little bit suspect to me coming from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I mean, Russia, again, does a lot of things that are deeply problematic. And Russia has been interfering in elections for many decades. Granted, the U.S. has.
Though.
Right? Exactly. We do it.
We've interfered way more. And there's no empirical proof of that.
Of what?
About Russia. CrowdStrike has come out and said that there was no proof that Russia hacked our elections. And I'm pretty sure that the tweets, the one of the Rainbow Jesus really didn't move a lot of people into moving for Vladimir Putin. I don't really think there was any type of significant interference.
It wouldn't be decisive. And again, that's not really the issue there. It's the antagonism. It's the fact that they would be perfectly happy with unraveling a lot of the governments across Western Europe and the U.S. And again, that there's a policy that goes back there into the Soviet period when they worked really hard to infiltrate countries, governments all across Europe. I mean, some of that is it's systemic. It's sunk into the political culture just like it is here. But you raise an interesting point there about Afghanistan. We are surrounding the Russians in their own former sphere of influence. We have had bases in Central Asia. We have bases across Europe. We have bases in former parts of the Soviet Union with, the Baltic states being NATO allies. And it puts the Russians on the defensive. And when at the same time, we don't pursue any of the arms agreements that would have lowered those tensions. I mean, the justification for building nukes in the first place was, the Cold War, the Russians can eat us alive, which is a whole bunch of nonsense. I mean, the Cold War was mostly manufactured terror on both sides. It had nothing to do with the real situation. But at the end of it, why did our military spending go up? Why not down? Why do we continue to maintain a massive nuclear arsenal? Why do we continue to maintain a first strike policy? Why do we continue to maintain chemical and biological weapons? Why do we have these things placed all over the place? Why are we weaponizing space? I mean, the whole Star Wars program that Reagan got started with, and we proceeded again hard with under George W. Bush and whatnot. I mean, that basically makes the Russian nuclear arsenal irrelevant. And in a conventional war, they can't do anything against us. There's no way they can stop us. The main reason a lot of states have pursued nuclear weapons, and you can take this from North Korea, Iran, all over the place, it provides a strategic deterrence. It's hard to argue that they don't serve a purpose in that sense. Russia could not win a conventional war. The nukes mean that it doesn't ever have to face one. It would actually face invasion again. But the ability to shoot the missiles down takes that away, makes them paranoid, puts them on edge.
So how do we stop this this obvious new Cold War then? If we continue the same foreign policy, I guess on day one, what would you do? Would you be in favor of promoting democracy into countries like China, Russia, or would you rather have a relationship where we're sitting down, talking, and having a conversation to pretty much be non-interventionists?
Quite honestly, I think a lot of it misses the real point. The reason that we proceed the way we do, and the reason we have the foreign policy that we do, is the military-industrial complex.
Right.
It's the manufacture of these weapons, and once you have tons of them, people in office will find a reason to use them. The way to end the conflicts with Russia and China honestly have nothing to do with their terrible human rights records, and it honestly have nothing to do with ours either. It has a lot to do with the fact that we are always on the verge of going to war, and we never really stop. We have been in a wartime economy since World War II. We never went back to our, plowshares from the Soviets. And we can't do that as long as we continue to elect people who are compromised by the defense industry. You mentioned Calvert at the beginning of this. His single biggest contributor is the military-industrial complex. He takes tons of money from defense contractors. As long as we have people taking in the money there, they're going to keep ordering tons of equipment that we don't need so that we can play world policeman. As long as we're playing world policeman, other countries are going to be on edge and conflicts will develop.
Yeah.
Okay, what about China then? Where do you stand on our relationship with China? What's going on? Do you think it's okay that we have American kind of back protest in Hong Kong, where the whole advisory committee is from the NED, and they're out there pushing things going on? They're trying to push another Cold War. They're actually talking about moving more ships into the South China Sea. How do you see or perceive our relationship with China?
Well, when the Soviets ceased to be a threat, and again, they were never a viable threat. There was never any chance of real war that they weren't suicidal. But when that disappeared and you couldn't point to it anymore with the collapse of the Soviet Union, enter Islamic terrorism so we could keep the money going for the weapons. As a lot of those are starting to wind down and people are getting tired of fighting in the Middle East, China presents the big threat for the 21st century to power the military-industrial complex. I mean, again, the whole thing ends up being a Titanic scam. I honestly think that the situation in China is similar to what it should be just about anywhere else. Let the people in the country determine the form of government that they have. If they want democracy, let them fight for democracy like anybody else has. It isn't our place to support or oppose democracy. And more often than not, in the last 70 years, the U.S. has opposed the extension of democracy around the world and propped up dictatorships. So on some of the few places where we make pro-democracy noises, like in the case of China, it does ring kind of hollow in that broader sphere because the real reason is the manufacturing a geopolitical enemy. Again, the Chinese do not have a good government. What's happening in East Turkestan with the Uyghur population is horrific. The basic cultural genocide of Tibetans. This, honestly, though, it's not a reason to maintain a militant posture towards them. It makes no sense for us to do so. And what it does is it strengthens the government there because they can play on nationalism. They can point to an outside threat that then can disguise from their own internal actions. And as long as you can maintain fear internally about an outside threat, authoritarian governments have a much easier time holding on to power.
So can you tell me the connection between immigration and regime change wars? Because a lot of people talk about immigration and the problems, and obviously we need massive immigration reform, but most people aren't able to make those connections between our foreign policy and immigration.
Do you mean in the sense that tons of refugees flowing out of, say, the Middle East and Central Asia?
In Central America.
Certainly, and all the wars, bombing territories, against narco-terrorism and all that business. Yeah. Obviously, we have acted to destabilize large parts of the world, and as a consequence, people are leaving. Granted, global warming is going to further destabilize a lot of these areas, and many of them are going to see massive refugee outflows regardless now. But across the 20th century, we contributed tremendously to refugee outflows, and in the early part of the 21st century, we've continued to do that. Tons and tons of people have had to flee the Middle East, right? I mean, there are a handful of small minority communities that held on in the Middle East just for millennia. I mean, the Mandean religion in southern Iraq goes back, their chief prophet is John the Baptist. And they've managed to hold on as a Gnostic faith all the way to the present. And they are almost completely extinct in their homeland. They've had to flee to half a dozen other countries just to survive because the war was so incredibly destabilizing in the area. I mean, this to me, it's horrifying. And then what do? We let this feed into right populist anti-immigrant rhetoric across Europe and the U.S. Oh, immigrants are coming here. Hello, stop bombing places, and maybe fewer people will leave home in the first place. I don't think it's a particularly great argument oftentimes to use because it seems in a way to accede to the racist assumption that people shouldn't be able to come here. But the simple fact is more do move to the U.S. or to Europe because their homes are being made unlivable by our actions.
Yeah.
I was going to push back and talk to you about the Uyghurs and whatnot and kind of China and Hong Kong, because I think sometimes we have such a United States point of view about what's going on, an imperialist point of view of what's going around the world. With the Uyghurs, there's a situation where a lot of people don't talk about the money that's been pumped in from the Saudi Arabian Wahhabist Salafists that have gone over there. That's really directly coming from the United States, spreading this form of Wahhabis because we support that regime there. But even still, how do we get people to pay attention to foreign policy then moving forward too as well? When to have these conversations when people don't care about it. You said people don't care about it. It's like young people. We can have a great debate about it because we love it, but how do we get other people involved to understand that our imperialism around the world is really a serious problem? Because like you said, we end these wars, that money comes home. The economic problem seems so much easier to tackle when you have half of 750 billion is what is it this year or something like that? So how do we get people involved?
I mean, that's definitely a good issue you can use, cutting back on the spending there. Another one is to point to the corruption, because it deeply compromises the Congress, the way that they spread these defense projects across almost every congressional district in the country, so that they're afraid of cutting any programs to losing jobs, so there's a big issue there. There's a massive corruption issue that we've got as well. I mean, certainly the long history of our intelligence services and problems that we've seen there, as well as the fact that I don't know, just point out to people that we're bombing 8 countries right now. And a lot of times they're like, what? I haven't heard that. Let's count them off, and then contributing to conflicts in tons of other areas. You mentioned the Saudis. I mean, that government can survive because we have armed it to the teeth, which means it can oppress its own population and keep democracy from ever happening there. And that allows them to then spend tons of their money elsewhere. I mean, we're not the reason that they're dumping tons of money into support like the Deobandis in Pakistan, but our support for that regime has a seriously negative consequence.
Yes.
Right. And getting people really to care about this is difficult, especially since one of the things that I try to bring to a lot of this too is I try to bring a little bit of nuance, because even when people do care, it often comes across as America good or America bad. And you don't end up with a lot of there are no angels anywhere. There's always complications and gray areas. And that gets to a very human problem. People don't like talking about gray areas. They want a nice, simple answer. What's the truth? And let's move on. And foreign affairs is one of the most complicated areas to talk about.
It is.
Because before you can even discuss anything there, you got to talk about the geography, the politics, the history, the economics, the different cultures in the area, the languages. I mean, there's a lot on the table. So, to make that a political issue in the U.S. is, I don't know. I'm skeptical it's even possible, but I still, because I'm interested, I'm always hopeful.
Yeah, I got to say though, before my partner goes on with the next question, that when I really want to get involved with foreign policy even deeper, is when I lost my cousin in the World Trade Center. And to understand what was going on with, Saudi Arabia and that area and everything, I had to start studying religion first. Like I had to spend a whole year just looking into religion before I can even grasp, and then the history and seeing what's going on. And so, yeah, it is very, very complicated and nuanced. Thank you for that answer.
It is, yeah. And it's, I mean, some of that stuff can help. I mean, we ended up with a lot of universities across the country actually started rolling out Mideast classes because of that. I mean, I was able to create the Mideast Studies program at Chapman University. It didn't previously exist because there was suddenly a bit more interest in this. And we've managed to try and sustain that by creating classes on the Israel-Palestine conflict, on the Arab revolutions, on tons of other areas, and continue to like pick up on something that's happening at any given time to try and spark a bit of interest. But it is difficult to sustain long term.
Yeah.
Yeah. We just saw that Amy McGrath beat Charles Booker. Bernie Sanders ran in 2016. There was massive amounts of election fraud reported, voter suppression. Then again, we saw the same thing in 2020. We've seen it back in 2000 between Bush and Al Gore. Then we saw it again in 2004. We've been seeing these things that people would classify as election fraud. In other countries, they would have decided that, the United States' elections are not really, they don't have integrity. They're not really fair. Did Bernie Sanders get cheated, do you think, in at least these last two primaries? And what's your opinion on how we can combat election fraud?
I don't know if there would have been enough differences to really change the outcome, but he was cheated. So I'm not sure. It depends on where you want to take that. He was definitely cheated out of a lot of things, and there's a lot of things that were done that made it a lot harder to gain any kind of support, even from the people who voted. I mean, certainly the media blackout in 2016 was pretty intense. The lopsided coverage, and just obviously Trump drowning everybody out in the primary here affects things too. It's very difficult. And then there's this massive push always from institutional forces. And this is true in both major parties. And it affects all of the different media broadcasters. I mean, people often are like, oh, MSNBC is so left. I'm like, yeah, no, they are so super corporate establishment. It's not even funny. Yeah. I mean, they are the Sanders death channel. I mean, they couldn't stand the guy. So we really don't have the fairest media in any way, shape, or form. I mean, and a lot of that has to do with the massive corporate control and concentration in it. They all have other financial interests to support, and they all have interest in maintaining the status quo. You can see that in, McGrath literally came out a few times as a Trump supporter, and the DSCC pushed her hard. I was getting like 2 emails a day from them begging for money. I was always like, no. But she's less threatening. Whether win or lose, you want somebody who's less threatening to the overall establishment. And that's just a matter of power dynamics more than anything else. It's a matter of preserving the current wealth structure of the country. And, pretty much anybody has an interest in sustaining that. And it's not as simple as pointing oftentimes to particular parties or institutions. These are power dynamics that we see in every society anywhere. I mean, the powerful do not surrender anything by choice.
Yeah. So how do we fix it?
If they can hold on to power by cheating, they will do it 99.9% of the time.
Yeah. So how do we fix it? Like, what are some solutions to deal with? Because what's the point of voting for people, especially the younger generations? What's the point of voting if your vote doesn't count, or if you feel like it doesn't matter, which is a lot of the apathy that the younger generations have. They don't vote because they feel like it doesn't matter. Like, what's the point? I don't decide who wins. What is the point of them voting for people in Congress? What is the point if we can't fix our elections? How do we begin to fix this problem?
Well, the problem there is made worse by the apathy. So that's the first good argument you can make against it. One of the reasons that things have gotten more corrupt in the U.S. and not less is because more and more people have checked out. As it got more corrupt, more people checked out, and it sort of feeds that. The other is we really have to find a way to tackle the corruption, and that means the campaign financing issue. And literally the only way to do that is to replace the people in office. Because plenty of them get in for some of the right reasons. They might be idealistic, but as soon as they're taking that money, they're compromised. And as soon as they begin to compromise that integrity, they become a part of the system that they may have opposed, in some way, mentally to begin with. So they become a part of the problem. Most people in office are deeply compromised by the system that they're in. We have to replace enough of them and win enough of the argument on the street and build up enough street power and enough people involved here to force some of the ones left to vote along with massive reform in the way things are financed. If you can replace enough people in Congress to shift that balance of power enough to get through bills that can absolutely remove that corruption, at that point, we can start moving in the opposite direction. As it stands, the U.S. has become less democratic in the last few decades. We are falling steadily on freedom indices, right? And this is a problem because it's unsustainable. If we continue on the current trajectory, this country becomes, a managed democracy at best. It becomes one of those fake republics, I don't know, Russia or like the Egyptian Arab Republic. Yeah, like elections in Egypt actually decide anything. No, we know who's going to win. Right? This is the path we're on, where the people in charge will simply pick who they want to be out in front and who will win the elections.
Yeah. I think, though, language matters, and we need to stop saying that he was cheated, but it wouldn't have made a difference. And I hear that argument all the time, and I sat in a room in the DNC convention and heard them say the same thing to Maria Estrada. Oh, yeah, she was cheated, but the numbers wouldn't make a difference. If you cheat, you lose. That's it. You're disqualified. And it should go, because if that's all we know, the cheating that's going on, how much more cheating is involved?
I mean, yeah, and in basic ethical terms, yeah, but on that, in that sense, like our elections aren't really fair in most of the country. We are one of the least democratic of all Western democracies.
Okay. Right? Well, with that being said,
but with one of the most corrupt voting systems, period. Okay. Which means that, I mean, it's going to affect every single election that happens. And again, if we didn't have just the fact that primaries are not even required, and that they could literally, somebody could win 100% of the vote in the primaries and they could throw it out and choose whoever they want. All right, the DNC is under no legal obligation to take the results of any primary seriously. He could have won 100% of the vote and they still could have thrown it out. That's a systemic problem.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, so let's talk about a country who had great elections. Venezuela. Jimmy Carter Institute said it was some of the best in the world, yet we're still trying to remove Nicolas Maduro from power. What is your opinion about the whole Nicolas Maduro, Juan Guaido situation, and how should the American foreign policy, start acting towards Venezuela? Stay the same or change it up?
How about stay the hell out of it completely? It had nothing to do with us in the first place. I mean, trying to support someone's usurping a power. I mean, Guaido is a usurper. It's an attempted coup, right? I don't think that. I mean, there are a lot of good things that the Chavista movement had done. I tend to think that Maduro is relatively corrupt and authoritarian, but the election was still fine. They didn't have the opposition did not get the votes.
How is he corrupt and authoritarian?
That would get us into the discussion of how this is actually structured, that ties into the military and the policing, right? The way that internal aid is used oftentimes to help to create a sense of dependency as well. I mean, the state is badly run in some ways, but in every possible way, we've made the situation worse. I mean, just the cutoff in investment under that government that's seen the collapse in their revenues. Yeah. I mean, they're essentially a petrostate, and realistically, oil is a curse to almost any country that has it because it tends to retard overall economic development. Countries become dependent upon it, but that revenue, cutting that off, destroyed a lot of the social programs that the Chavez was trying to put into place. And the collapse of a lot of those programs made the movement steadily more desperate to try and hold on to and maintain what they were trying to do. And that's where things get a little bit more problematic. Over time, the movement got more authoritarian because it was increasingly squeezed, which means that we played a significant part in creating that situation.
Yeah, well, you want to ask number 9? You want me to ask it?
No, a lot of people refer to Trump as a fascist, but while he may be extremely authoritarian, many Democrats have also been authoritarian, pushing things like the Patriot Act, pushing recently H.R. 6666, the ability to spy on Americans, the ability to infringe on our civil liberties. We have seen recently journalists be arrested, literally people like Julian Assange be maligned to the entire public. Is one better than the other at this point? Like, are Republicans worse than Democrats, or does it even matter to have these dualities?
That's a pretty complicated philosophical question, really, because at the end of the day, anything that's stripping our liberties is difficult to justify in any way, shape, or form. And whether you prefer one authoritarianism or the other, I mean, I don't know, they're both awful. The use of fascist to refer to Trump, I have real mixed feelings about, in large part because a lot of the people who've done it really have no idea what it means.
Right.
Just being an authoritarian is not fascism. It's just not, right? I get people all the time, Antifa's the real fascist, because they don't want me to have my free speech. I'm like, no, that makes like zero sense. Like, so the whole thing is sort of like compromised by that. That said, there are 9 basic characteristics to fascism and neo-fascism, and Trump's ideals fit into all of them. So to say that Trumpism is not a right populist neo-fascist movement would be kind of disingenuous. I mean, Putinism is as well. There's quite a few of them in the world here. I mean, Bolsonaro's movement in Brazil. I mean, there are basic characteristics that you're touching on. Do Democrats over and over again vote for the restriction of American civil liberties, the harming of our elections, for our campaign financing to get worse and worse, for our massive defense budgets, for wars and wars and wars? I mean, the Speaker of the House had said that they knew that W. Bush had lied about Iraq, but they weren't going to impeach because it was okay, right?
Yeah.
It's like okay to kill, like, I don't know, we're responsible for about as many deaths in Iraq as Saddam's government was over 25 years. I mean, it's a horrific situation there. I mean, things really got bad in Iraq for people and are still bad, and we have to take responsibility for that. So, yeah, has the Democratic Party establishment been much better? Not really, but can you call them fascist? No, because it does have a meaning. I mean, and
control of the speech by the state. I mean, they own all the media. Okay, Susan Wojcicki is the CEO of YouTube right now. She's a big Clinton donor. They shadow ban. They keep our mouths down. They get to determine the narrative. Isn't that a fascist?
It's not. It's not part of the definition of fascism. Communist governments always controlled. They were authoritarian. They're not fascistic in controlling free speech. Monarchies controlled free speech. So the Ancien regime before the French Revolution practiced heavy censorship. Is that fascism? No. I mean, suppression of speech and control of speech is not one of the defining characteristics of fascism. It is authoritarian. It is deeply authoritarian and problematic. And this is, again, if you wanted to debate,
well, yeah, I mean, they're speaking on behalf of the corporate state. So, I mean,
yeah. And honestly,
the merging of the corporate state and the government itself is a form of fascism. Okay?
It is.
So, yeah. I mean, all roads lead to Rome. If they're speaking on behalf of the corporate state, that's a form of fascism.
It is. It points to what Wolin called it for inverted totalitarianism, with corporate control over everything, where we have essentially a corporate autocracy in the country at this point, and both parties are deeply implicated in that. But not all forms of totalitarianism are fascist. Fascism has a very specific, both anti-liberal and anti-conservative sort of reactionary view to it. It has to be radically nationalist. It focuses on charisma. There's a kind of anti-intellectualism to it, where it focuses entirely on emotion and big rallies and spectacles and that sort of thing. It has a powerful misogynistic current to it. There are a lot of specific characteristics that you can see in every fascist movement over the course of a century. And not all forms of totalitarianism or authoritarianism are fascist, but they're all
ultimately lead to it.
And that, well, it doesn't necessarily lead to it, but again, gets back to that philosophical question. Is there a form of authoritarianism that's better or worse? I mean, fascism is terrible. Is Mao's cultural revolution somehow good because it isn't fascism? No, it's still a horrifying form of totalitarianism and a cult of personality. I mean, a lot of the ones we saw in the Arab dictatorships, are they somehow good if they're not necessarily fascist? Is the Saudi government good? I mean, for not being fascist? The Saudi government is in no way fascist, but it is a horrifyingly brutal, authoritarian state, right? It is an absolute monarchy. So, I mean, trying to decide if something is better or worse, I mean, honestly, it's kind of like beside the point. Can we criticize all of them? Can we say that restriction of civil liberties, restriction of democracy, that like crushing people's rights is a bad thing, period, and just go from that? That'd be my kind of like moral stance. And like trying to like split hairs and say, well, your authoritarianism is worse than mine. I don't get those arguments personally.
All right. We can agree to disagree in some form right over there, but thank you for your point of view. Who did you vote for in 2016 in the primary and the general? And same thing in 2020. Who'd you vote for in this last primary? And who are you planning to vote for presidente?
In the 2016 election, I was pretty strongly for Bernie all throughout the primary. I might have statted out or voted, independent, as I often have in the past, but I wanted a repudiation of Trumpism, so I voted for Clinton in the general. I wanted to see like a landslide repudiation of his kind of like race baiting and white supremacy, and that didn't work out. So I'm kind of bitter about that. In the 2020 primary, I again backed Sanders, although I have a lot of friends that overlapped in a number of other movements there, some of the other progressive candidates and whatnot, but I was always very much the Bernie-crat. We prefer for that one there.
Yeah. What other candidates did you like in 2020 other than Bernie?
Bernie was like far and away the best there. There were a number of them that had like certain things that stood out to me. I really liked that the Williamson was talking about things like reparations and foreign policy. Those stood out a lot to me. I liked that Yang tried to get people to talk about just the data per se and not the ideologies, and talking about automation and basic income, which I was happy to see that idea kind of come back into the mainstream. There were a number of things that like stood out about individual candidates, but none of them touched enough of the issues. Bernie checked off nearly every box. I wish that Bernie talked a bit more about automation and whatnot, and I wish he was a little bit less economically nationalist per se. I mean, he has a history of like the whole stronger borders, all that kind of stuff, and some of his own issues with immigration, but he's gotten much better on those areas. But in like 99.9% of areas, I agree with Bernie. So
who are you going to vote for in 2020 for the president?
I mean, I don't think that there's really any option, is there? I mean, what we're going to get. I mean, I'll probably end up having to back Biden again for the same reason as Clinton. I don't like anything about Biden's policies, but I'm not comfortable with Trumpism in any way, shape, or form. And I think that we'll have an easier time organizing as a left and pushing back against it if we're not facing the threat of like being labeled terrorists and sent off to Guantanamo.
So counterpoint to that, because I think a lot of the awakening in 2016 came from Bernie Sanders and his movement, and him kind of unraveling how bad of a candidate Hillary Clinton was, taking the mask off of people like her, the establishment. Then, of course, we had Donald Trump, and we had Donald Trump win, which unleashed a whole anti-Trump movement that was an immigrant reform movement, and now we're seeing Black Lives Matter. I don't think any of that would have happened had Hillary Clinton cinched the nomination. I think having somebody like Donald Trump, as horrible as he is, did kind of take the mask off of politics, because Trump is pretty much politically, foreign policy wise, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but foreign policy wise, Donald Trump and Joe Biden have very, very similar outlooks. Joe Biden himself has said under Joe Biden, nothing will fundamentally change. So to me, it just seems a little bit obtuse to think that we have to vote for Joe Biden. I'm not going to vote shame anybody for voting for Joe Biden, but I feel like I get vote shamed when I say I'm not going to vote Joe Biden, because Joe Biden hasn't done a single thing to earn my vote. He refuses to do pass Medicare for all. He refuses to defund the police. He wrote the crime bill, for God's sakes. I mean, what is Joe Biden offering me and my generation and those younger to get me to vote for him?
Nothing at all. No, but neither did Clinton, really. Although realistically, the negotiations with Bernie did give her the most progressive platform we'd had in decades. But whether she would have actually done much of it, yeah, hard to say. But it's it goes to me. It goes well beyond the person on the top, and we have created an imperial presidency. The amount of power that we have in cabinet positions and appointments. Trump has appointed already 1/4 of the federal judiciary. They have appointed fewer people to positions in the executive branch in order to further destroy things. I mean, Reagan's policy of regulatory capture, which was taken up a notch under W, has just gone through the roof under Trump. They are unraveling large parts of the basic of the state as a whole. And the problem here for me is I just have, I guess, for me personally, and again, I won't vote shame anybody. I mean, honestly, my dog would make a better president than either of them, really. But I won't vote shame anybody. But I cannot personally stomach just how bad things go under Republican presidents. I mean, I felt that way about W2 and how obscenely corrupt that government was, about Reagan's government and how obscenely corrupt the government was. Yes, are Democrats incredibly corrupt as well? Yes, sure. But there's less damage and fewer people actually will die under it. I mean, the poverty spiking. I mean, what you see with like, okay, think about the way that the unraveling of tons of the social services and the tax cuts for the rich and everything else here have seen like a massive plummet in the wealth from most people while it's spiking for the rich, right? So you'll have like falls in our standard of living and our quality of life, and then it'll plateau a little bit under Democrats, wobbling a little bit, not getting any better. And then it's
like the bailout that Obama gave to the big corporations in 2008 when he threw millions of people out of his house. I would say that was another dip. You know, and it was Clinton who signed NAFTA. It was Clinton who repealed Glass-Steagall. I don't see any of this argument that you're making over here trying to say that Democrats are a little bit better than the Republicans, because at least the Republicans pull back, and Donald Trump especially pulls back the curtain on the Wizard of Oz, and now we can see him for what it is. You know, Joe Biden is the architect of the system.
But here's the problem with that, right? We saw that already under W, and people made exactly the same arguments there. I mean, one of the first things he's doing is like, yeah, let's put more arsenic in the drinking water. I mean, from the time he entered office for 8 years, it was a complete shit show. Yeah,
and Obama went and drank the water and convinced people that was okay. That's more sinister. That's more nefarious.
Sure, but the change was done there, and the point here is, did it? What did it lead to? It gave us we got worse with Trump. Go back further to Reagan. Reagan was horrific. I was hoping that we would never have a president that stupid again. And we keep appointing people that are worse.
Yes.
Right? And there was people at the same time saying, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, yes, Reagan is terrible here, but it'll help the left and it'll encourage our movements here and things will grow. I mean, it doesn't happen. I mean, the agitation seeing like Clinton didn't make things better. Clinton's a conservative. There's no way around that.
Yes.
I mean, I voted against Bill Clinton in the 92 primary.
Yes.
Right? The direction that the party has gone, you know, since the 1980s is horrifying, right? But it did not actually change anything. It didn't actually improve the situation. You get more people angry for a while. I mean, think about the outrage there was in 2000. About the shameless rigging there, and then all the stuff, and then the wars that the W took us into, and all the anti-war protests here. Did it make anything fundamentally better? No. We got
that's the thing, right?
Another conservative
administration. We can say the same thing about both parties. Like electing either corporatist hasn't made anybody's life better.
I will never argue that voting for someone like Joe Biden makes anything any better.
Yeah.
It makes it worse because people go to sleep, just like they did with Obama. Well, they don't push back as much.
Well, I'm not going to argue for somebody to vote for Trump or Biden. But what I am saying is I think it is a very legitimate position to have, to not vote for either one, to support third parties, or just really take your vote and tell the establishment. I mean, what we're seeing in the streets right now could very well also be a mass general strike, economic movement demanding somebody better than the two choices we have. I think, you know, for the longest time, the wheel has been spinning and spinning, and we've been choosing these two kings, one or the other, and they're both poison. So I think people are waking up to the reality that neither one is going to be the solution, that people need to demand solutions. And which is why it's a conundrum for me, because I feel like, what's the point of voting sometimes when we just don't have a solution? We need to demand. I'm for voting for Congress and for people up and down progressives, but at the same time, I think we need a movement in the streets, and I think that's what it's going to take for these issues to get the attention that they deserve. And a lot of progressives, and the reason I feel like this is because a lot of progressives that we've elected, like the Squad, seem to be having to protect their seat because Nancy Pelosi dictates what committees they get on. So they are playing ball, in my opinion, a lot of them, especially foreign policy wise. And what's the difference of you getting in there, being in their position? Like, how are you going to manage to really try to get things done and not lose your morale or to, be playing ball all the time? Because it just seems like, okay, great, we get progressives in there, but then the change is so slow, incremental, and we just don't have that time.
Well, that again is a good part of the problem. And we can't be content to think that, oh, we got AOC in there, things are going to get better. And it's not going to happen. We need 200 more AOCs. And one of the things that she at least has done pretty well is maintain her fundraising independence. She's not had to, toe that same kind of corporate line and suck into that cash. The more people you put in there, the more of us willing to pitch in the price of a coffee or whatever and support progressive candidates all across the country, the more chance we have of actually instituting systemic reform. It doesn't matter who you have as president. Ultimately, the presidency doesn't change much. And I can take that back over 150 years. The actual institutions themselves are the problem. Right, the structure of it is the problem. People thinking Obama was going to fix things. No, Obama was never really intended to fix things. And honestly, no individual president is going to have any significant impact. Bernie himself would have been compromised by a significant number of the positions, would have maintained most of our foreign policy. Yep. There would have been tons of areas where he would have disappointed people still in office, which honestly, I think could have done damage to the movement as well. Now, honestly, I think we need to reform more of the Congress by putting enough people in to change the laws so we can start to change the political culture. You mentioned the street politics. Honestly, I was on the ground for the Arab Spring and continue to. I teach a class every year on the Arab revolutions and whatnot. We need more people power in this country. Union membership is down to its lowest level since before the Great Depression, and most unions have grown more conservative. There's not a lot of civil society organizations that really bring people together, and a lot of movements that we have today, like BLM, are essentially leaderless. They're much more ad hoc, which was one of the problems we had with Occupy. Occupy briefly got tons of people out in the streets and then completely fizzled. It accomplished, in the long run, nothing. But it does show that some people are frustrated and angry, but we can't sustain a lot of that frustration and anger. And honestly, I don't know that either of them, it doesn't matter ultimately who's going to be in, we're still going to have to do the same problem of convincing people to get angry and do something about it, because the street politics are where it's really going to change. Street politics in Congress and in the state houses.
I think the Tea Party kind of spawned the Freedom Caucus, which eventually spawned Donald Trump. We didn't see that with Occupy. They didn't turn their movement into political power. I wish it did happen.
Both. We have to do both. We need to build a stronger street politics, and we need to connect it to progressive candidates that aren't corrupted by the system. And if you get enough of them in, electing me, no. Is it going to change the direction of the country? No, not at all. But you're going to get one more angry voice in the House of the Floor calling out corruption on either side and demanding change. And you get another one and another one and another one, and then we can finally get there. But it's a hard fight. There's no way around it. But honestly, we're up against some really deep systemic issues.
Let's get to some super chats. Thank you so much for joining the show today, Liam. Greg Allen says, scarcity is fake. Love you. We got a couple. Thank you for the super chat contribution. We might have a question or two in here. I'm not sure. I'm trying to get back to the first. Here's the first one. David, if Mao Tse-tung had not come along, China would be the biggest slave colony of the Western fascist USA and Europe. The stock market equals elite supremacy. Do you have anything to say about that? Because you made a comment about the Mao Tse-tung movement before. Mao Zedong.
Yeah, again, this is not to say that the situation that China had before Mao was any better, or things wouldn't continue to get worse without him either way. But it doesn't mean that there weren't atrocities carried out by that government as well. And again, I tend to spread the blame out wherever I see it. I'm not going to view anything through rose-colored glasses there. But the stock market is a giant. The stock market's not the economy, right? This is an oligarchy, and those investors are basically pulling all the strings anyway.
Yeah, I would agree.
All right. And Dan McCartney said, spread the love, that action. Thank you so much for the super chat contribution.
Any more questions?
Yes, one more is the last one down below, the $14.99 one from Tunisia, right? Liam, I am from Tunisia, where the Jasmine Revolution started in 2011. However, I hate it when it gets called the Arab Spring, as Tunisia is not Arab. It's the only Arabophone by occupation. Arabophone?
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, there are a lot of those kind of like more recent nationalist sort of arguments. You get those in a lot of places, like the Carthaginian sort of argument, Neo-Phoenician arguments in Lebanon or whatever. There, yeah, Arabic was exported into other countries by force 1,400 years ago, but.
Yeah.
Arabic isn't even per se a language. It's a language family. It's like Spain speaks a Romance language because of the Romans, because it was imposed on and the original languages were forced into extinction. It's the same situation in Tunisia. I mean, it's people speak a form of Arabic as the most common language in Tunisia. And honestly, what makes somebody think Arab it's not like any kind of historical or biological definition. It's the language you speak. That's all that. I mean, what you look like is completely irrelevant to like what it means to be quote unquote Arab. But there are a lot of interesting movements sort of like pushing back and trying to add a certain like national diversity in the Arab world, which I think is personally fascinating. And I completely agree on Arab Spring. Absolutely. Arab uprisings or the Arab revolutions, depending on whether you want to talk about the long-term span here or just the what's been unfolding since 2011 are the terms I prefer. Yeah.
That's interesting. Somebody also pointed out, point out when the Democrats started taking corporate money, they kicked all the real leftists, and when Bill Clinton came to power, the purge culminated.
Mm-hmm. Nope. Yeah. Again, I opposed that shift completely at the time. I mean, I think we need to get back to a bit of like FDR to LBJ, sort of like, big progressive visions, talk about big policies, go back and like, let's talk about doing real things for the American people again. Let's abolish poverty. Let's dream big instead of saying, well, Wall Street doesn't like that, or Hollywood doesn't like that, or this or that bank doesn't like that, so we're not going to do it. Like, hell with that. Like, let's talk again and really do what's going to help the American people.
Well, thank you for this conversation, Johnny. Did you have any?
Johnny, you got a question, right?
Yeah, I got a couple of questions.
Okay.
Julian Assange, what would you do?
What I do? I'm not sure I understand the question. Like, what would I do? I mean, I
drop the charges, or?
Yeah, I wouldn't try to prosecute.
Yeah, do you think he's a hero, or?
I mean, really neither. I mean, I don't think he's a hero or a martyr or anything like that. I mean, I like whistleblowers in general. I like, material being put up there. I tend to prefer actually having people go through the material instead of like the massive dumps, because you end up with like Pizzagate and crap like that. But, realistically, the large dumps too, you can find things that maybe some of the experts might have missed too. So, I mean, I'm kind of on the fence about a lot of that kind of stuff. I tend to contradict myself on issues like that. But yeah, I don't have a problem with whistleblowers in any way, shape, or form. I don't think that they should be prosecuted for what they're doing, but I also don't, try to hold him up as a particular hero in personal terms.
Okay.
I'm not committed any crimes.
I'm not big into like heroes though.
Right.
Do you think he committed any crimes? Is there an area where he thought maybe he overstepped his boundaries?
I don't know. I'm not sure I would say so. But again, I think some of the things get more problematic when it's easier to deal with, say, the way the Pentagon Papers were handled, where it was turned over to experts to look through and they could like redact certain names there. When it's all dumped out at once, then you can end up like putting someone's immediate life in jeopardy or this or that. And when those come up, yeah, I mean, that's a bit more problematic too, which again is why I tend to prefer trying to bring in some kind of scholars there. At this point, I wouldn't trust the media with most of this stuff. The New York Times is not what it would have been, and when it was willing to expose Vietnam and Watergate and from Washington Post back then and all that. It's gotten too consolidated and too tied into the overall corporate framework here. But, to a bunch of academics, for example, find a political science department and say, here, take this stuff and go through it. And then they can black out somebody's name and put out the information. In terms of actually releasing the material to public, though, at all, I don't think in any way, shape, or form that's a crime. I think that itself is a heroic action, at least. Because we need that. Democracies need whistleblowers, period. Doesn't matter what democracy, doesn't matter what period, there's always corruption, and corruption needs someone shining a light on it.
Abolish the CIA?
I would abolish and consolidate most of our intelligence apparatus. We don't need 17 intelligence agencies, and we certainly don't need the structure we built in the early Cold War that gave groups like CIA and NSA way too much autonomy. I mean, the CIA is not even technically under the executive branch. It's an independent form of the executive. It's an independent part the government and does its own thing. And I don't think we really need that. I mean, I don't think we ever needed it. And I think that that the lies people bought into in order to create it in the first place, we have to push back hard against. Sadly, a lot of people still believe the narratives that they were sold in the early Cold War that justified it. So it's hard to win those arguments. But we have, created a deeply complicated and corrupt system here with too many intelligence agencies, and some of them have way too much autonomy for my taste. But again, I'm personally a civil libertarian. I don't like the idea of spying organizations in general on principle. So,
Right.
the less the better for me.
I'm a progressive libertarian. That's what I call myself. No, gotcha. Anything else, Johnny?
Well, I mean, historically, I'm what we call like I identify more with like the left libertarian or anarchist tradition.
Interesting.
I oppose hierarchy.
Yeah.
And that hierarchy can be like an overpowerful state, with its secret services and its military and everything else there, or it can be corporate power and, sort of like this neo-feudal power there. They both oppress people and they both need to be opposed. The right's co-optation of the term libertarian honestly offends me.
Yeah.
So,
I give him shit all the time.
Because that Libertarian Party is like who they just nominated, she doesn't seem too libertarianish when it comes to foreign policy, at least. I don't know.
Or economics. I mean, there is actually a libertarian socialist caucus within the Libertarian Party, so that's kind of cool. I have some friends that are part of that. But lot of the Libertarian Party's economics are deeply authoritarian and hierarchical.
Right.
I mean, they're basically looking for some kind of dystopian state where like a few people own everything and control everyone. And I'm not down with neo-feudalism.
Yeah. You said that Julian Assange wasn't a hero. Who is your hero? I mean, I can tell you mine.
I think again. I don't have.
You don't have a hero?
It's a personal thing for me.
I agree with that.
I personally.
Red Hampton is my hero.
Yeah, it's a good choice. It's a good choice. There are a lot of people that I like, but it's one of the. I'm sort of at the extreme end of seeing everything in kind of like gray shades of gray and nuance and whatnot here.
Yeah.
And they all have problems. I mean, they're like, "Who's your favorite president?" I'm like,
well, that's because human beings are flawed, and they shouldn't be elevated to a status of preaching to them, or like I think that's done a lot of harm in our movement and in general, like in politics.
Just in human history, it's a great deal of harm, but it's also. It's common psychologically, and it makes sense. So I don't have any problem with people having heroes, but for me, I would rather steal good ideas from a ton of different people and meld them all together. So I could list tons of influences and people that I have drawn tons of information from and ideas from, but I wouldn't consider any of them a hero.
Where can we find you?
The website is liamomara.org. So liamomara.org. And then very active on Twitter. So LIAMOMARA-IV, fourth at the end of that. Same thing for Facebook. I'm active on social media.
Awesome. All right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank Liam O'Mara for joining the show today. He's running in California District 42. It's just him and that Republican that's been there for 28 years. You might not agree with him on everything, but go take a second look on him. He's definitely a better choice than the guy he's running for. Hate to say that, but he is. And thank you so much for coming on the show, Liam, and good luck in November.
Thanks much.
For Pasta Jardula,
Fiorella,
Johnny Sue on the ones and twos. Join our Patreon.
Convo out.